The first thing to go wrong was not the snow, it was the light. For 3 mornings, the sun never truly rose over the mountains above the little town in the valley. A pale gray glow hung there instead, thin and cold, like ash settled over glass. The fields stopped shining. The world lost its color. And most people never looked up at all. But high on a lonely ridge of granite, far above the rooftops and the smoke and the ordinary noise of town, an old man stood very still. His name was Ezra Calloway. The wind pulled at his coat. It found the gaps at his collar and his sleeves, the way the cold always finds an old man first. He did not move. He only watched the far peaks, where a dark seam of cloud lay low against the snow. It was not moving fast. That was the thing that troubled him. It was moving slow and steady, like something enormous taking its time. Beside him sat a gray-muzzled cattle dog named Cinder. The dog would not settle. His ears stayed forward. His nose lifted into the wind, and from somewhere deep in his chest came a low sound, almost too quiet to hear. Ezra rested a hand on the old dog's head. "I know," he said softly. "I see it too." Below them, the town went on living. Chimneys breathed thin ribbons of smoke into the gray. A wagon creaked along a frozen lane. Somewhere a child laughed, and the sound carried up the ridge, small and bright and unaware. Everything looked perfectly normal, and that was exactly what frightened him, because Ezra Calloway had learned, a long time ago, that the worst storms never announce themselves. They come dressed as an ordinary morning. They come while the town is still laughing. He pulled his gloves tighter and turned toward home. The mountain had shown him enough. The cabin sat tucked inside a hollow of granite, half a mile above the rooftops below. Most folks in town had never climbed up to see it. They didn't need to. They had already made up their minds. They called it Calloway's Hole. The name had followed him for months. Through every winter wind, every wagon load of timber hauled up the icy slope, every nail he drove with hands that ached more each year. People shook their heads when they spoke of it. An old man, they said, building a strange little house inside a rock. As if a pile of stone could keep anybody safe. As if he'd lost something up there besides his good sense. He never argued. He simply kept building. And now, as he pushed open the heavy door, the cold fell away behind him, and warmth reached out to meet him like an old friend. A woman looked up from the table. Adeline Calloway had a face the years had been gentle with, soft lines drawn by smiling more than frowning. Folks in town called her Addie. She had married Ezra when they were both young enough to believe the world owed them an easy life, and stubborn enough to keep loving each other after they learned it didn't. She took one look at her husband's face, and she did not ask a single question. She rose, poured coffee into a tin cup, and pressed it into his cold hands. He wrapped both palms around it and held on, the way a man holds on to something steady. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked in the stove. The old dog circled twice and lay down at Ezra's feet. The wind leaned against the granite walls and found no way in. It was Addie who finally broke the quiet. "Bad?" she asked. He stared into the flames. "Maybe," he said. That was all. But she had been married to this man long enough to read the weather of his silences. She knew the difference between the quiet of a tired man and the quiet of a worried one. When other men were afraid, they talked too much. When Ezra was afraid, he went still. He was very still now. She set her hand over his, over the cup, over the warmth they were sharing. "Then we'll get ready," she said simply, and there it was, the whole of their marriage in 4 small words. No panic, no questions, just the two of them, turning together to face whatever was coming. Because here is the thing the town never understood about the old manster on the ridge. He had not built that cabin out of pride. He had not built it to prove anyone wrong. He had built it out of grief. Years before, in another valley, in another life, there had been a different winter. A winter when the sky turned this very same shade of gray, and a younger Ezra had stood in the cold and felt the warning in his bones. He had tried to tell people then, too. He had knocked on doors. He had pointed at the sky. He had begged them to listen, and they had smiled at him the way you smile at a man who worries too much. And they had gone back inside, back to their suppers and their warm hands and their ordinary evening. The storm came that night. And by the time it was over, the cold had taken something from Ezra Calloway that no amount of years could ever give back. A person he had loved more than his own life. Someone who had trusted him to keep them safe, and whom he had not been able to save. He never spoke her name aloud anymore, but he carried it with him up that ridge in every stone he set, in every beam he braced against the wind. The cabin in the granite was not a house. It was a promise that he would never again stand helpless in the cold. Never again watch the people he loved be swallowed by a sky he had seen coming. That was why the old man read the mountains the way other men read the morning paper. That was why he watched the light instead of the calendar. He had paid for that knowledge in the only currency that truly costs anything. And the town did not know. The town only saw a strange old man, and a strange little house, and a dog that wouldn't sit still. That night, long after Addie had gone to sleep, Ezra stayed beside the window with a worn leather book open across his knees. By the low gold of the lantern, he wrote down what he had seen. The color of the sky, the shape of the cloud, the way the wind had turned. Small notes, patient notes. The careful handwriting of a man who had learned to trust the land more than he trusted his neighbors. When he finished, he closed the book, and he looked out into the dark, out there, somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the cold and the quiet. Something was gathering against the peaks. He could feel it the way you feel a held breath in a silent room. The mountain was no longer whispering to him. It was warning him. By the door, the old dog lifted his head, his ears turned toward the window, and he let out that same low sound again. Softer this time, almost like a question. Ezra reached down and rested his hand on the gray fur. "Soon," he murmured. "Not yet, but soon." Outside, the first flakes began to fall. Only a few at first. Slow, almost gentle. The kind of snow that looks like a blessing. The kind that fools a whole town into thinking the night will be peaceful. But the old man on the ridge knew better. He sat there a long time, watching them drift down past the lantern light, one after another after another. And in the warm dark of the cabin he had built from sorrow, with his wife asleep and his old dog beside him and the fire breathing low, Ezra Calloway waited for the thing he had spent his whole life dreading, and the thing he had spent his whole life getting ready for. The snow stopped sometime before dawn. It left the world hushed and white, and so deceptively gentle that a person could almost forget what the sky had looked like the day before. By morning, the whole valley lay under a soft new blanket, every fence post wearing a little white cap, every rooftop rounded and kind, every hard edge in the world smoothed over. It looked like a blessing. That was the cruelest thing about it. Because high on the granite ridge above the town, an old man stood at his cabin door and looked down at all that gentleness, and felt his stomach turn cold. Ezra Calloway had lived long enough to know that the worst storms always send a calm ahead of them. A still morning, a pretty sky, a quiet so complete it makes a whole town let down its guard. He had seen that quiet before. He had learned in the hardest way a man can learn anything, never to trust it. So while the valley slept on beneath its pretty new snow, the old man pulled on his heavy coat, and he saddled his horse with stiff and aching hands, and he made ready to ride down into the town one more time. His wife came to the door behind him. Adeline Calloway was not a woman who wasted words. She had a face the years had been kind to, and eyes that missed almost nothing, and a quiet way about her that people sometimes mistook for softness, right up until they crossed something she loved. "They won't listen," she said. It was not a question. She knew this town. She had lived beside it her whole life, watched from the ridge as it laughed at her husband season after season. "I have to try," said Ezra. "I know you do." She reached up and turned his collar against the wind, the way she had done 1,000 cold mornings. "That's why I married you." A pause. "Fool that I am." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then he climbed onto his horse, and he turned its head toward the long slope down, and the old dog, Cinder, fell in beside him without being asked. And the two of them went down off the ridge into the dangerous, beautiful quiet of the morning. The lower he rode, the more ordinary the world became. That was always the way of it. Up on the ridge, with the wind in his face and the sky pressing low, a man could feel the truth of what was coming in his very bones. But down here, among the smoke and the breakfast smells and the small, busy sounds of people starting their day, the whole thing began to feel like a bad dream that daylight had chased away. The town was waking into a fine, bright morning. A shopkeeper swept fresh snow from his wooden walk, whistling to himself. Two ranchers leaned against a rail, breath steaming, arguing cheerfully about the price of beef. A boy chased a runaway hoop down the lane, shrieking with laughter, his cheeks bright red. Nobody hurried, nobody worried. Why would they? The sky was clear. The snow was pretty. The morning was kind. Ezra rode through the middle of it all like a shadow no one wanted to see, and he felt the weight of the thing he carried settle heavier on his shoulders with every step. He tied his horse outside the low building where the mayor kept his office, and he stood a moment in the cold, gathering his words, because words had never come easy to him. He was a man who spoke with his hands, with timber and stone and patience. Talking was the one craft he had never mastered, but some things have to be said, even when no one wants to hear them. The mayor's name was Conrad Pike. He was a soft, pleasant, well-fed man who liked the world to stay exactly the way it was, and who had built a comfortable little career out of telling people what they wanted to hear. He looked up when Ezra came in, and a careful smile arranged itself across his face, the smile of a man who has already decided not to believe you. "Mr. Calloway," he said warmly. "Cold enough for you?" Ezra did not waste time on weather. "There's a storm coming," he said. "A bad one. Worse than anything this valley remembers." For a moment, the office was very quiet. The fire popped in the grate. A clock ticked somewhere, and the mayor leaned slowly back in his chair until the leather creaked beneath him, and that careful smile widened just enough to turn into something else. "A storm," he repeated. "Yes. And how would you come to know a thing like that? Before it's even arrived." Ezra turned his hat slowly in his hands. "The light," he said. "The color of the sky these last 3 mornings. The clouds sitting low on the far peaks, doubling by the day. The winds turned wrong. The cold's coming on too fast." He paused. "I've seen these signs before, every one of them, and I know where they lead." The mayor nodded slowly, the way a grown man nods at a child describing a monster in the closet. "You've seen them before," he said. "Up there, in your cabin, in my life," Ezra said quietly. But the mayor was already shaking his head, already reaching for the comfortable thing, the easy thing. "Mr. Calloway, I'll tell you something. Every single winter, somebody walks through that door absolutely certain the heavens are about to fall on us. And every single winter, the snow comes, and the snow melts. And come spring, we're all still here, planting and complaining like always." He spread his soft hands wide. "This valley has stood through more storms than you and I have years between us. It'll stand through one more. Not this one. We'll be just fine." The mayor rose, the meeting clearly finished in his mind. "But I do thank you for your concern. It speaks well of you. Truly, it does." And that was the whole of it. Ezra looked at him a long moment. He saw a kind man, a weak man, a man who would rather everyone be comfortable today than safe tomorrow. Then he put his hat back on, and he walked out into the bright and treacherous morning, carrying his warning back out the door with him, still unspoken, still unheard. Out on the street, he tried again. He was not a man who gave up easily. That, too, the years had taught him. He stopped the whistling shopkeeper, and he told him plainly to lay in more wood than he thought he'd need, to see to his roof, to bring anything precious in off the porch. The shopkeeper laughed friendly enough and went on sweeping. He spoke to the 2 ranchers at the rail. He told them to bring their stock in close, down out of the high pasture, into whatever shelter they had. They exchanged a look. One of them tapped his temple just slightly when he thought Ezra wasn't watching. He stopped a young mother hurrying her little ones along the walk, and he told her, gentle as he could, to keep her wood dry and her cupboard full and her children close in the days ahead. She drew the children nearer to her, but it was Ezra she drew them away from. She gave him a thin, frightened smile, the kind you give a man you have decided is not quite right, and she hurried on. And then he came to the builder. Jonah Reed was a broad, capable man with sawdust worn permanent into the creases of his hands, and he had once climbed that very ridge himself, back when the cabin was half built, and stood inside the rising stone walls and told Ezra to his face that the whole thing was foolishness, that a house tucked into a rock would never breathe right, never hold heat, never stand the wind. Now he was loading lumber onto a wagon, his teenage son working beside him. Ezra stopped. "Jonah," he said, "there's weather coming, the kind that tests a man's roof. See to yours, and keep that boy of yours close." Jonah Reed straightened up, and he wiped his hands on his trousers, and he looked at the old man with something that was not quite cruelty, but was not kindness either. "Calloway," he said, "I build the houses in this town, solid ones, houses that sit square on good ground, the way houses are meant to." He nodded up toward the ridge, where the cabin sat hidden in its hollow of stone. "Not holes in a cliff. You worry about your roof. I'll worry about mine." The boy beside him said nothing, but the boy was looking at Ezra, really looking in a way his father was not. There was something thoughtful in the young face, something unsure. Ezra met the boy's eyes a moment. "Keep him close," he said again, quietly. Then he moved on. He had spoken to nearly everyone who would stand still long enough to hear him. Shopkeepers, ranchers, mothers, the builder, one after another, and one after another. They had smiled and shaken their heads and gone back to their bright and ordinary morning, certain that the strange old man who lived in a rock was worried about nothing at all. The town had made up its mind about Ezra Calloway a long time ago. A single morning was not going to change it. And then there was Roland Tate. Tate stood at the center of the street, in a coat finer than any other man's in town, holding court the way he always did. He owned more land than anyone in the valley. He owned the best of the grazing flats, and the water that ran through them, and a great deal of the goodwill that money can quietly buy. He was the kind of man who walked into any gathering already certain he was the most important person there. And usually, he was right. He saw Ezra coming from halfway down the street. A slow grin spread across his face, the grin of a man who has just been handed the morning's entertainment, free of charge. "Well now," he announced, loud enough to carry, "look who's come down from the mountain, the man who talks to the sky." A few of the men around him chuckled on cue. Ezra kept walking. He had hoped, this once, to simply pass them by, but Tate stepped into his path. "Tell us, Calloway." His voice was easy and amused and cruel in the particular way that only very comfortable men can be cruel. "What's she saying today, your mountain, whispering secrets in your ear again?" The chuckles grew into laughter. Ezra stopped. He looked at the gathered men, at their warm coats and their easy faces and their bone-deep certainty that the world would go on being kind to them, because it always had. "There's a storm coming," he said, plain, steady. "Lay in your wood. Bring your cattle down off the high ground. Look hard at your roofs while there's still time. That's all I came to say." For just a heartbeat, something flickered across one or two of the younger faces. Tate stamped it out before it could catch. "My roofs," he said, loud and certain, "have stood 15 winters without complaint. My barns are the soundest structures in this valley, built by men who know what they're doing." He turned to his little audience, performing now. "And this man lives in a hole in a rock, and he's come down to lecture me on building." The laughter came easy then, warm and ugly. Ezra felt the old, familiar weight of it settle over him. He had carried that weight a long time. He could carry it a while longer. He moved to step around, but Tate's voice followed him, and now the laughter had drained out of it, and what was left underneath was harder and colder than anything the sky had shown him all morning. "You know, Calloway," he said, "that ridge you're squatting on, that's fine high ground. Good summer grazing, that. Real shame, seeing it wasted on one stubborn old man and his pile of stones. Ezra stopped walking. He turned, and for the first time, he looked at Roland Tate the way a man looks at something he has finally, fully understood. Because all at once, it was clear to him, the mockery, the grins, the whole long winter of jokes at his expense. It had never been simple cruelty for its own sake. It had a purpose. Tate had been working the town slow and patient, the way a man works a green horse he means to break, making the old man on the ridge into a joke, making him small, making him strange and laughable, and not quite a real person. So that when the day came to push him off that land, no one in the whole valley would think twice about it. That land is mine, Ezra said. For now, said Tate, and he smiled. The two of them stood there in the cold a moment, and the street had gone a little quieter, the way a place does when something real rises up underneath all the noise. A few of the men shifted, no longer quite laughing, sensing they had wandered too close to something that was not a joke at all. Then Ezra Calloway turned and walked away. He did not give Tate the gift of an answer, but something in his chest had gone tight and aching, because he understood now that he was not only fighting the sky, he was fighting men who wanted in their hearts to watch him fail. There was a moment after that Ezra did not see. When the old man's back had disappeared down the street, Roland Tate's smile faded into something flat and thoughtful. He looked up at the ridge, at that little cabin tucked into the granite, and he did not laugh. He had not become the richest man in the valley by being a fool. He had become rich by watching what other men wanted and finding a way to stand between them and it. Stubborn old goat, one of his men muttered. He won't last, Tate said quietly. Men like that never do. They hold, and they hold, and they hold. And then one hard winter, they're gone, and somebody sensible takes the land. He turned away from the ridge. I can be patient. And there it was, the cold, patient thing beneath the laughter. The old man had heard the joke. He had not heard the plan, but he had felt it, the way he felt everything, in his bones. He had one more stop to make before he climbed home. The little post office sat at the quiet end of the street, and inside it, behind a worn wooden counter, a woman named Eleanor Shaw was sorting letters into their narrow slots. She was somewhere past the middle of her life, with quick gray eyes and steady hands and a way of watching the world that missed almost nothing. She had stood at her window through the whole of that bright, cruel morning. She had seen the men laughing in the street. She had seen the young mother pull her children away. She had seen the old man walk out of every conversation with his back straight and his warning unheard. When Ezra came through her door, she did not laugh. She set down her letters. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He nodded to her. He was tired now. Tired all the way down to the soles of his boots. The particular tiredness of a man who has spent a whole morning shouting into a wind that will not turn. "You'll think me a fool too," he said, "same as the rest." "I haven't decided what I think yet," said Eleanor. "I'd sooner hear it first." And something in the plainness of that, in the simple, rare miracle of a person willing to actually listen, made the old man's shoulders come down just a little. So he told her about the light, about the clouds on the far peaks, doubling and darkening by the day. about the wind that had turned and the cold coming on too fast, and the old dog who would not sit still no matter how he was coaxed. Eleanor Shaw listened to every word of it. She did not interrupt. She did not give him that careful, dismissing smile he had collected a dozen times already that day. She only watched his face, the way you watch a man who is telling you something true, and she weighed his words the way she weighed a parcel in her hands, carefully, honestly, taking their full and proper measure. When he was finished, she was quiet a long moment. Then she reached for a scrap of paper. She dipped her pen, and she wrote something down. "What's that?" Ezra asked. "The day," said Eleanor. "The day you came in and told me." She set the pen down and looked up at him. "If you're wrong," she said, "no harm's done. I'll have wasted a thimble of ink, and you'll have wasted a cold morning." She paused. "And if you're right, then someone in this town ought to be able to say, after, that you tried to warn us, that you came down off that mountain and you tried, and that one person, at least, had the sense to listen." Ezra Calloway looked at that small scrap of paper, that little date, that tiny, quiet act of faith offered to him freely in a town that had given him nothing all morning but laughter. And for the first time since dawn, the old man's eyes stung. "Lay in wood, Miss Shaw," he said, his voice rough. "More than you think you could ever need, and keep your water where it won't freeze." "I will, and tell anyone who'll hear it to do the same." "There won't be many," she said gently. "I know." He set his hat back on his head. "But every soul that listens is one more than there was before." He turned to go, and at the door he stopped, and without quite looking back, he said the truest thing he had managed to say in that whole long, bitter morning. "Thank you," he said, "for not laughing." Then he stepped out into the cold. He did not see what Eleanor Shaw did after the door had closed behind him. He did not see her stand a long moment with that scrap of paper in her hand. He did not see her tuck it carefully into the drawer beneath her counter, the drawer where she kept the few things that truly mattered to her. He did not see her cross to the window and look up, past the rooftops, past the rising smoke, all the way up to the gray granite ridge where his cabin sat tucked into the stone like a secret. And he did not see the moment when Eleanor Shaw, alone in her quiet little post office, began, very softly, to be afraid. The ride home was long, and the wind found him well before he reached the top. It was a different wind than the mornings. It had teeth now. It came down off the high peaks in long, cold breaths, and where it passed, the loose snow lifted and curled and ran along the ground like something alive and searching. And the sky had changed. That dark seam of cloud he had watched for 3 days had spread. It was no longer a thin band along the far peaks. It had grown and thickened and crept down the slopes toward the valley until it covered half the heavens in a low gray ceiling that seemed to press down on the whole world like a hand. The old dog trotted ahead, then stopped, then looked back at his master as if to ask why a man would move so slowly with the sky doing what it was doing. Ezra did not hurry. There was nothing left to hurry toward. The warnings were given. They had been laughed at, waved off, and finally threatened. Whatever the town chose to do now, it would do without him. He had done everything a man could do, and it had not been enough. That was the part that sat heaviest in him. Not the laughter. He could bear the laughter. It was the knowing what was coming, and not being able to make a single soul see it. That was the old wound, opening again. The same helplessness, the same gray sky leaning down, the same terrible feeling of standing between the people he might save, and a danger they refused, with all their hearts, to believe in. He had stood in that exact place once before, in another winter, in another life. He had sworn over a loss he never spoke of that he would never stand in it again. And yet, here he was. Halfway up the slope, he reined in the horse and sat a long moment, looking back down at the valley below. The little town, with its smoke and its first lamps beginning to glow yellow against the gray afternoon. The lanes where the children had run that morning. The rooftops Roland Tate had sworn would stand another 50 winters. So small from up here, so fragile. Let me be wrong this time, the old man said quietly. To no one, to everyone, to the sky itself. Just this once, let me be wrong. But even as the words left him, he knew. He had never once in all his long years been wrong about the sky. Adeline was waiting at the cabin door when he came up over the last of the slope. She did not need to ask how the town had received him. She read it all in the set of his shoulders, in the slow and heavy way he climbed down from the horse, in the long breath he let out as his boots sank into the snow. She had seen that look on him before. She had spent her whole life loving a man the world found strange, and she had never once, not for a single day, been sorry for it. Come inside, she said, before you freeze out here grieving for people who wouldn't grieve for you. He almost smiled. Inside, the cabin had changed since the morning. While Ezra had been down in the valley collecting laughter, his wife had been at work. Extra blankets now lined the shelves, folded and stacked and ready. The water barrels stood full to their brims. Crates of food sat tucked away in the cellar, sorted and counted with a careful hand. And along the wall, the firewood was stacked higher than it had been that morning. And she was not finished. Even as he watched, she pulled her coat back on and went out into the cold for more. He moved at once to help her. Sit, she said. You've ridden all day. Addie, I said sit. But of course, he did not sit. He never could, not while she worked. So the two old people carried wood together in the failing light, log after log, their breath clouding the air between them, neither saying very much at all. There was no need to say much. That was the thing about loving someone for as long as they two had loved each other. The words wore smooth over the years and fell away until what was left was something better and deeper than words. A glance, a hand reaching to steady a slipping load, the simple, daily, unspoken faithfulness of two people moving through the cold side by side, as they had moved through everything. She paused once, an armful of wood held against her chest, and looked at him over the top of it. You're afraid, she said softly. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. It was not a thing he would have admitted to another living soul in all the world. Not to the mayor, not to Tate, not to one single person in that whole valley below. But he had never once lied to Addie, not in all their long years together. For us? She asked. He shook his head slowly. We're ready, he said. This cabin will hold. I built it to hold. Every stone of it. He turned and looked down toward the valley, where the lamps glowed small and yellow against the deepening gray. I'm afraid for them, Addie. For all of them down there. sleeping easy. Adeline followed his gaze down the mountain. She knew what those little lights meant to him. She knew exactly what it cost him to stand there and look at them. She knew, better than any other living soul, what her husband carried up that ridge with him every single day of his life. The weight of a winter long past, and a sky that had once taken something from him the long years had never seen fit to give back. She set down her wood. She crossed to him, and she took his cold face between her two warm hands, and she made him look at her. "You warned them," she said. "You did everything a good man could do, and more. Whatever comes now, Ezra Calloway, it does not rest on your shoulders. Do you hear me? It is not yours to carry." He closed his eyes. "I hear you," he said. But she knew he did not believe it. She knew he would carry it anyway. It was simply who he was. It was, God help her, a great part of why she had loved him all these years. So she did the only thing left to do. She kissed his cold forehead, and she picked her wood back up. And she said, steady as stone, "Then let's be ready to take care of whoever down there is wise enough to come climbing." That night, the snow began again, and this time, it did not fall gently. It came slantwise on the wind now, fine and hard and fast, hissing against the granite, gathering in every hollow and corner of the world. The lantern in the window threw its small circle of gold against the dark, and beyond that little circle, the whole night had gone wild and white and endless. Ezra sat by the window with his worn leather book open across his knees. He wrote down what he saw. The hour the wind had changed its voice, the way the snow no longer fell but flew, sideways, like it had somewhere to be. The cold, dropping faster now than it had any right to drop. Small notes, patient notes, the careful record of a man who had learned, long ago and at great cost, that the land always tells the truth, even when not one living person will believe it. Beside the stove, Adeline mended an old coat by lamplight, her needle moving slow and sure. At her feet, the old dog Cinder lay with his nose pointed toward the door, ears twitching at every shift and moan of the wind. And far out in the screaming dark, beyond the glass, beyond the lantern's little reach, something vast was settling down over the mountains. The thing the old man had seen coming for 3 long days. The thing he had ridden down and tried to warn a whole town about, and been laughed at for his trouble. He closed his book. He looked out at the storm gathering its terrible strength against the window, and far below, in the valley, the lamps were going out now, one by one, as the town went to its warm and certain beds, safe and easy, and sound asleep, and entirely unaware that high above them, on a ridge they had only ever climbed inside their jokes, an old man and his wife sat together in the lantern light, waiting, with everything they had, for the thing the whole valley refused to believe was coming. The wind rose higher, the snow flew faster, and slowly, slowly, the long night closed its white hand around the mountains. The storm did not arrive the way a storm is supposed to arrive. It did not build slow, the way the snow had built all through the evening. It did not come in stages, the way a kind storm does, giving a body time to draw the shutters and bank the fire and brace. It came all at once, sometime in the black heart of the night, while the valley slept easy in its beds and the lantern burned low in the cabin window. The wind came down off the high peaks and hit the mountain like something thrown by a giant hand. The whole cabin shuddered. A deep, rolling roar broke across the ridge, and the snow no longer fell, and it no longer even flew. It slammed, sideways, against the granite, with a sound like a thrown fistful of gravel striking stone, again and again and again, faster than a heart could beat. The old dog came up off the floor in an instant. Cinder stood rigid in the firelight, every gray hair along his spine lifted, his ears flat to his skull, a low growl rolling deep in his chest at the thing howling beyond the walls. He stared at the door as though some living creature crouched on the other side of it, trying to get in. Ezra Calloway sat up by the window. He had not truly been asleep. A man who knows what is coming rarely sleeps the night it finally comes. He looked out into the dark, and there was no dark left to look into. There was only white, churning, moving white, lit a faint and ghostly silver by what little moon could fight its way through. A wild wall of it, swallowing the world one piece at a time. The far slope, gone. The near trees, gone. The very edge of the ridge, 10 steps from his own door, gone. Adeline came and stood beside him, a quilt pulled around her shoulders, her gray hair loose. For a long moment, the two of them said nothing at all. They only stood at the cold glass and watched the night come apart at the seams. "It's here," she said at last, softly. "It's here," said Ezra, and he reached down and laid his hand on the old dog's trembling back, and the three of them stood together in the small gold circle of the lantern, while the whole mountain shook around them in the dark. By the first gray hint of morning, the world beyond the cabin had simply ceased to be. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was no line drawn between the two of them, no horizon, no familiar shape of a single living thing. There was only the storm, white and roaring and total, rubbing the whole world out like chalk from a slate. But inside the granite hollow, the lantern still burned steady. The fire still ticked in the stove. The walls stayed dry to the touch. The warmth still moved exactly where the old man had built it to move, gathered and held and folded back by the stone itself. The thermometer beside the door had barely shifted from where it had sat the night before. The old man had built well. He had built out of grief and out of love, and out of a promise made long ago over a loss he never spoke aloud. And now the mountain itself had become his shelter, taking the full fury of the storm onto its broad granite back before it could ever reach the two old people warm inside. Ezra walked to his worn leather book and opened it by the firelight and wrote a single line. The first day. The cabin holds. Outside, the storm screamed against the stone. Inside, there was only the soft scratch of his pencil and the slow, settling breath of an old dog finally lying back down at his feet. Far below, the valley was learning the lesson the old man had tried to give them for nothing. The roads went first. They simply vanished, swallowed under drifts that climbed faster than any man alive could shovel. Then the fences disappeared, rail by rail by rail, until all the careful lines that divided one man's land from his neighbor's were gone, and the whole white world had become one single, unbroken thing. Then the paths between the houses went. People tried at first. People always try. They came out into the howling cold with their shovels, and they dug little tunnels between their doors and their wood piles, between one house and the next, and the wind filled in every foot of it nearly as fast as they could clear it. An hour's hard labor, gone in minutes. A whole morning's work, erased before noon. By the middle of the first day, the town understood that it could not dig its way out of this, and a cold far deeper than the cold outside began creeping into people's chests. Because now they remembered. They remembered a strange old man riding down off the ridge, his hat held in his two hands, telling them plainly what was coming. They remembered laughing in his face. In her small house at the quiet end of the lane, a woman named Eleanor Shaw was not laughing, and she was not afraid the way her neighbors were afraid. Because Eleanor Shaw had listened. She had taken the old man at his word. She had laid in wood, more than she thought she could ever need, just as he'd told her to. She had filled every vessel in her house with water and set it where it would not freeze. She had brought her small store of food in close, and she had checked her roof, and she had done every plain and humble thing a strange old man had begged a whole town to do. So while the rest of the valley dug and panicked and despaired, Eleanor Shaw sat warm by her own steady fire and grieved for all the people who had not. Through her frosted window, she could just make out the house of the young mother next door. Dark now, no smoke rising from the chimney. Out of wood, most likely, or saving the last of it in fear. Eleanor did not think long about it. She bundled herself against the cold, and she filled her arms with split logs from her own goods store, and she fought her way the short and brutal distance between the two houses, and she pounded on the door until the frightened young woman opened it. She put the wood in the woman's arms without a word. And then she looked up past the rooftops, up past the smoke that was not rising anymore, up to the gray granite ridge, lost now somewhere behind the storm, where she knew a cabin still stood, warm and dry and holding. He tried to tell us, Eleanor said quietly, to no one. The poor man. He stood right there, and he tried to tell us all. Then she went back inside to wait out the dark. One small light still burning in a valley that had laughed itself into the cold. In the finest house in all the valley, Roland Tate stood at his window and watched his world disappear. He was not laughing now. His cattle, the ones he had been too proud and too certain to bring down off the high pasture, were out there somewhere in all that white nothing, and there was not one thing on God's earth he could do about them. His fine wide barns, the ones he had bragged would stand for 50 winters. He could hear them now, even over the wind. He could hear them beginning to complain. The first crack came a little after noon, a single sharp sound, high up in the largest barn. Small, easy enough for a moment to tell himself it was nothing at all. Then came another, then another. Tate went out into the storm with 2 of his men, their heads down, roped one to another against a wind that would have carried them off the earth. They fought their way to the great barn doors and hauled them open. And what they saw inside turned the proud man's stomach to ice. The roof beams were bending. 15 hard winters of snow had never so much as troubled them. But this was not 15 winters of snow. This was the thing an old man had read in the color of the sky 3 full days before it ever arrived. And the weight of it was pressing down on that proud roof like the very hand of judgment. The beams groaned, they bowed, and somewhere deep inside them, slowly, with a sound like a tree splitting, something began to give. Out, Tate said. His voice had gone strange. "All of you, out, now." They had barely cleared the doors when one whole side of the great barn came down. It did not fall like a building falls. It fell like a living thing dropping to its knees. A long, tearing, splintering roar, and then a vast and terrible soft crash, and a cloud of snow and broken timber flung up into the screaming wind. And then nothing. Just the storm, closing back over the wreckage as though no barn had ever stood there at all. Roland Tate stood in the howling white and stared at the empty place where the soundest structure in the whole valley had been only a moment before. And for the first time in a long life of getting exactly what he wanted, the proud man was afraid. High on the ridge, Ezra heard the distant sound of it, a low, far-off boom, half swallowed by the wind. He knew what it was. A man who has spent his whole life listening to the land knows the sound of a thing built by pride coming down. He felt no gladness. There was no gladness anywhere in him. He simply walked back to his book and picked up his pencil and added one more quiet line beneath the first. "Something has fallen in the valley." That was all he wrote. Adeline looked up from the stove. "Tate's, do you think?" "Maybe," said Ezra. "Hard to say from up here." He set the pencil down. "Doesn't matter whose it was, Addie. A roof's a roof. There are people under every one of them down there, sleeping or not. And that was the whole difference between the two men. One had looked up at this ridge and seen good grazing land wasted on a stubborn fool. The other was looking down at the valley right now, in the middle of his own long-dreaded storm. In the home everyone had mocked him for building, and grieving for the very people who had laughed in his face. The first day passed into the second, and the storm did not weaken. That was the thing that finally broke something down in the valley. Not that it was fierce. Storms were always fierce. It was that it would not stop. Hour after hour after hour, with no pause, no weakening, not one single moment of mercy. The wind drove the snow sideways across the world and buried everything just a little deeper than before. But inside the granite hollow, the cabin held. The stove burned. The kettle steamed. The water stayed soft in the barrels. The thermometer read exactly what it had read the day before, and the day before that. Adeline made a thin and careful soup, and the old dog dozed by the warmth, and for a little while there was something almost like peace in that small, warm room above the dying valley. And then, in the gray middle of the second day, came the knock. It was so faint at first that it might have been only the wind. A small, broken, irregular sound, lost beneath the endless roar. But the old dog heard it. Cinder's head came up off his paws. He scrambled to his feet and rushed to the door, and this time he did not growl. This time he whined, high and urgent, scratching at the wood with both paws. Then it came again, louder. The unmistakable sound of a fist striking a door. Someone was out there. Someone was alive out there. In all of that, Ezra was on his feet at once, snatching up the lantern. Adeline was already moving behind him, gathering blankets without being asked, without needing to be told. He threw back the heavy bolt and hauled the door inward, and the storm exploded into the room. Snow and screaming wind, and a cold so sudden and so cruel it stole the very breath from the lungs. And out of all that white chaos, Two figures came falling forward across the threshold. One went straight down, collapsing onto the cabin floor. The other stayed up by sheer will alone, swaying, one frozen hand braced against the doorframe. Ice caked their coats from collar to boot. Frost hung white in their eyebrows and their lashes. Their hands were pale and stiff and curled like an old man's. For one long moment in the wild swinging lantern light, Ezra could not even make out who they were. Then the light found their faces, and the old man went very still, because the man swaying there in his doorway, half dead and frozen near to the bone, was Jonah Reed, the builder, the very man who had once climbed this ridge and stood inside these rising walls and told Ezra Calloway to his face that the whole thing was foolishness, that a house tucked into a rock would never breathe right, never hold its heat, never stand against the wind. The man who had carried that judgment all through the town, the man who, only 2 days past, had loaded his lumber onto a wagon and told the old fool to go worry about his own roof, and the one who had fallen to the floor was his boy, the same boy who had stood in the street and looked at Ezra with something thoughtful and unsure in his young face. Jonah Reed lifted his head. His cracked lips moved. No sound came at first. Then, in a voice scraped raw and ragged by the cold, he forced out 3 words. "My son, please." And whatever might have been said in that moment, whatever a smaller man might have been so very tempted to say, none of it was said. Ezra Calloway did not speak one single word about the past. He did not say a thing about the laughter, not about the jokes or the cruelty, or the day this very man had stood in his half-built home and called his life's work a hole in a rock. He simply moved. Addie, blankets, the boy first. Get him to the stove. He got his arms beneath Jonah Reed and dragged him clear of the doorway, and then he threw his whole aging weight against the door and forced the storm back out where it belonged and shot the bolt home. And then the 2 old people went to work, the way they had worked side by side their whole long lives, wrapping the frozen father and his frozen son in blanket after blanket, pulling them close to the stove, chafing the warmth back into hands that had very nearly stopped feeling anything at all, holding warm cups to lips that could barely close around them. The boy stirred first. A low moan, a flutter of frost-rimed lashes. His father wept at the sound of it, wept openly, the proud builder, the tears cutting bright tracks down his frozen face. Not for himself, never once for himself, only for the boy. And Ezra knelt there beside the man who had mocked him, holding a warm cup steady for a son who had so nearly died in the snow, and he felt no triumph in it, none at all. He felt only the old, deep, familiar ache, because the old man had once knelt over someone he loved, in the cold, in another winter, in another life, and there had been no warm cabin then, no stove, no door to open against the storm. There had only been the snow, and the long, terrible silence that came after it. He had built this cabin, stone by stone, so that no living soul would ever have to know that silence again. And now, here was the living proof of it, breathing and weeping and warming on his own floor. It was Adeline who finally said the thing aloud. She looked across the firelight at her husband, at the rescued builder and his slowly waking boy, and then she turned and looked at the door, where the storm still raged and clawed and screamed to be let in. "There'll be more," she said quietly. Ezra nodded. He had known it already. "Reed found his way here," she went on, her voice low. "Through all of that, he found his way to the one place he swore would be the first to fall." She paused. "If a man who hated this cabin could find it in the dark, then others will come too. Mark me." "They will," said Ezra. He rose, slow, his knees aching, and he crossed to the window, and he looked out into the white nothing where the whole valley had vanished from the earth. And he understood, standing there in the lantern light, that this was no longer a night to be merely survived alone with his wife and his dog. The door was open now, in every way that a door can be open. The cabin that the whole town had laughed at had just become the only safe place left in all the world, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep and cold in his chest, that the next soul to come climbing out of that storm would be one he had even less earthly reason to save. He did not have long to wait to learn who it would be. Down in the valley, in the wreck of his proud estate, Roland Tate had come at last to the end of his certainty. His great barn was down. His second was failing. The fine house he had raised to be the envy of the whole valley was groaning now under a weight no builder had ever thought to plan for. Ice spreading slow through its walls, the cold creeping in under every fine door. His men had scattered to save their own families. His cattle were lost to the white, and the storm gave no more sign of stopping than it had the moment it first struck. He stood in his failing house, the richest man in all the valley, and he had nowhere left on earth to go. Nowhere but up. He had known it for an hour, and he had refused with all his pride to let the thought take shape. But it took shape now. There was one place in this whole valley that would still be standing, one place built to hold against this very thing, one shelter that he himself had laughed at and schemed against and sworn before witnesses that he would one day take for his own. The hole in the rock, the fool's cabin. The home of the one man in all the world he had treated worst. For a long and terrible moment, Roland Tate stood in the ruin of his pride, and he could not make himself do it. The thought of climbing that ridge, the thought of pounding on that door, the thought of looking into the lined old face of Ezra Calloway and asking, begging, for the very mercy he himself had never once shown the old man. The wind shrieked through a widening crack in his fine wall, and somewhere above him a great beam gave a long, low, warning groan. And in that sound, Roland Tate finally understood something. That pride is a luxury for men who still have a roof over their heads. That out here, tonight, in the teeth of this thing, all his land and all his money and all his hard certainty were worth precisely nothing. And the only currency left to spend in the whole frozen valley was kindness, the one thing he had spent the entire winter mocking. He pulled on his heaviest coat. He wrapped his face against the cold. And he stepped out into the killing storm, and he began to climb. The wind fought him for every single step. The snow was thigh-deep, and then it was waist-deep, and the cold reached straight through his fine clothes as though they were made of paper. More than once he fell, and lay there in the white, his strength leaving him, and more than once the memory of his own warm laughter, his own cruel and easy words, rose up to shame him back onto his feet and drive him on. He climbed for what felt like half a lifetime, and at last, half frozen and wholly, finally humbled, the proudest man in the valley dragged himself up into the granite hollow where the cabin stood. Its warm light glowed faint and gold through the driving snow, the one light left burning in the whole dark and dying world. He stood before the door of the man he had despised, and Roland Tate, who had never once in all his long life asked another living soul for anything, raised his frozen fist and knocked. For a long moment, the old man did not open the door. He stood with his hand resting on the cold iron bolt, and he knew, the way a person always knows, exactly who was standing on the other side of it. He had heard that voice in the street. He had felt the cold purpose buried under all that easy laughter. He knew the very shape a proud man makes, even half frozen, even half buried in the snow. Adeline watched her husband from across the small, fire-lit room. She did not tell him what to do. After all their years together, she did not need to. She only watched his face in the wavering lantern light and waited to see what kind of man he would choose to be, now that the choosing had finally, after everything, come into his own two hands. Ezra drew the bolt. He opened the door. And there, slumped against the frame, frozen and shaking, and stripped of every fine thing he had ever owned in the world, was Roland Tate. The two men looked at each other through the driving snow, and everything that had ever passed between them seemed to hang there in the freezing air. The mockery in the street, the laughter of the other men, the quiet, patient scheming, the promise to take this very ground out from under him. Ashamed to see it wasted on one stubborn old man and his pile of stones. Tate's cracked lips moved. Whatever words he had climbed all that way to say, the cold had stolen them clean out of his mouth. And Ezra Calloway, who had every right under heaven to shut that door in the proud man's face, stepped back and held it open wide. "Get in by the fire," he said, "before you lose those hands." That was all. No triumph in it. No reminder of anything. No settling of any old and bitter score. Just an open door. And a warm fire. And room enough somehow for one more. After Tate, they kept on coming. The storm had told the whole valley the same hard truth all at once. And one by one, in the screaming dark, the people of the town remembered where the only safe place left in all the world had been built. They came stumbling up out of the white, half frozen, wild-eyed, clutching whatever small thing they had thought to carry. A ranch hand who had lost the trail 3 times on the slope and found it again only by the faint gold glow of the window. An old couple, older even than Ezra and Addie, leaning their whole weight on one another, taking the mountain one trembling step at a time. The young mother from the lane below, her 2 small children bundled deep inside her own coat against her body, her arms locked so tightly around them that it was a long while before anyone could coax her to let go. And then, near the end of that long gray day, came another knock. When Ezra opened the door this time, the figure that pitched forward against him was not a stranger. It was Eleanor Shaw. She was spent, shaking, snow-caked to her waist, her breath tearing in and out of her, the last few steps more falling than walking. She had roped a small sled to her body and dragged it up through the worst of it, and only sheer stubbornness had carried her the final stretch. But lashed to that sled, behind her, was a load of split firewood. Her own firewood. The wood she had laid in, because she had listened. Ezra got her inside, sled and all, and pressed a warm cup into her frozen hands, and it was a long moment before she could speak at all. "I figured," she got out at last, through chattering teeth, "that a man who told a whole town to lay in wood would have a houseful by now, and not near enough of it." Ezra stared at her. "You came up into this," he said, "on purpose, to bring wood." "I had wood," said Eleanor when she'd caught a little of her breath. "And you've got people. Seemed simple enough, when I set out." A faint, exhausted smile. Felt a good deal less simple about halfway up. She looked past him at all those faces crowded in the warm dark, and something in her went soft. "Now, are you going to let an old woman thaw by that fire? Or are you going to stand there gawking?" And the old man laughed. It was a small, broken, astonished sound. The first time he had laughed in days. Then he helped her in and carried her wood to the pile himself. One after another, they came, and not one single soul did the old man turn away. By the deep of that night, the little cabin in the rock held more living souls than it had ever been built to hold. People pressed shoulder to shoulder against the warm granite walls. Wet coats steamed on every hook and rail and chairback. Boots stood in a long, crooked row by the door. The children slept in tangled piles beneath borrowed blankets. The old folk dozed sitting up, chins to their chests. And the young kept watch with their knees drawn up tight, listening to the storm that would not die. Rich and poor, young and old, ranchers and shopkeepers, a builder and a mayor, a postmistress and a proud man brought low. And the storm, screaming and clawing outside the walls, no longer cared one single bit who any of them had ever been. And inside, by the firelight, slowly, neither did they. Adeline moved among them all like the steady, beating heart of the place. She had a way about her, that old woman. She did not fuss. She did not panic. She never once made a single soul in that room feel like a burden or a bother. She simply took what little food there was, and she stretched it further than any person there would have believed it could go. The potatoes went whole into the soup pot. The dried beans were counted out one careful handful at a time. The bread was sliced thinner than thin, and then thinner still, until somehow every last person in that crowded room had something warm to hold between their two cold hands. Nobody complained. Nobody so much as dared to ask for more. And when a small girl, frightened and far from her own little bed, began to cry softly in the dark, it was the old dog who went to her. Cinder rose from his place by the stove, and he picked his way careful across the crowded floor, stepping gentle between the sleeping bodies, and he lay himself down against the little girl's side, warm, heavy, steady as the mountain itself, and he stayed. After a while, her small hand found its way into his gray fur, and her crying eased, and then it stopped, and she slept the rest of that night with her fingers curled deep into his coat. He went to the oldest among them next, then to a shivering boy. Wherever the fear lay thickest in that room, the old dog somehow seemed to know it, and he went there, and he lay down, and he stayed until the trembling stopped, and for the first time in 2 long and terrible days, a few small, tired smiles appeared in the gold of the firelight. But warmth and kindness for all their power, do not stop a fire from burning down. And somewhere in the smallest hours of that night, Ezra Calloway looked long at his stacked wood, at Eleanor's wood added to his own. And then he looked at the rows upon rows of sleeping people, and quietly, in his head, he did the hard arithmetic that no one else in that room had the heart to do. There was not enough. Not enough wood to keep that many warm bodies from the cold, if the storm should hold another 2 days. Not enough food to fill that many empty bellies for long. The cabin had been built and stocked for 2 old people and a dog. Not for half a frightened, freezing town. He said nothing of it, not yet. But Roland Tate had been watching the old man's face. And Roland Tate, even half frozen, even wholly humbled, was still a man who had spent his entire life reading what others wanted and finding the way to stand between them and it. He saw the arithmetic in Ezra's tired eyes, and the old fear, the old hunger, the old grasping instinct that had once made him rich and made him cruel. It woke right back up inside him. He rose, unsteady, in the crowded dark. "There's not enough," he said, loud enough that the nearest sleepers stirred. "Is there, Calloway? Not enough wood, not enough food, not for this many." Heads lifted in the firelight. A child whimpered and was hushed. "Now I'm a practical man," Tate went on, and the old hard steel was creeping back into his voice with every word. "And practical men face facts. Look around. Some folk here are strong. Some are weak. Some will be of use come morning. And some are just mouths to feed." His eyes moved over the room, cold and counting. "If we mean to last this thing out, somebody has got to decide. Who gets the wood? Who gets the bread? And I'd say a man who's run a great outfit his whole life is better fit to make a hard choice like that than—" "No." The word was quiet, but it stopped Roland Tate dead. Ezra Calloway had not raised his voice. He had not risen up in anger. He simply stood there by his own dwindling fire in the home he had raised with his own 2 aging hands. And he looked at the proud man with something that was not hatred at all. It was something far worse, for a man like Tate to have to receive. It was pity. "In this house," the old man said, "there is no such thing as a mouth." He let those words settle into the silence. "Nobody here gets more, because they happen to come up the mountain with more. And nobody gets less because the world already saw fit to give them less. The wood gets shared. The bread gets shared. The cold, if it comes to that, gets shared too. Right down to the last split stick and the last thin crust." He paused, and his gaze swept the room. "And we will all of us walk out of here together, come the thaw," he said. "Or we won't. But no man under this roof decides whose life is worth the saving. Not while there is breath left in my body to say otherwise." The whole cabin had gone utterly still. Tate stared at him. "You'll all of you freeze," he said. But the steel had gone out of it now. His voice had gone thin. Being noble. "Maybe we will," said Ezra. "But if we do, we'll freeze as people, not as your livestock." And then the old man did a thing that not one soul in that room had expected. He crossed the floor, slow, to where Roland Tate stood, ashamed and shaking in the firelight. And he took up a blanket, and he laid it gently around the proud man's trembling shoulders. And then he guided him down to a place by the fire, a place no better and no worse than any other place in that crowded room. "Sit," Ezra said, and his voice had gone gentle. "You climbed a long, hard way to get here. Warm yourself now." And Roland Tate sat, and something deep in the proud man's face, quietly, came apart. It was a young voice that finally broke the silence. The builder's boy, wrapped in his blankets by the stove, watching the old man with those same thoughtful, uncertain eyes he'd had that day in the street. "Mr. Calloway," the boy said softly, "why'd you build it here? Everybody always said it was foolish. A house inside a rock." He swallowed. "Why'd you do it?" The old man was quiet for a long, long moment. The fire ticked. The wind moaned low against the granite. And slowly, every pair of eyes still open in that crowded room turned toward him, there in the flickering gold. And Adeline. Adeline went very still by the stove, because she knew the thing her husband had never once spoken aloud in all their long years together. And she knew, watching his weathered face in the firelight, that he was about to speak it now, at last, to a room full of the very people who had laughed. Ezra lowered himself down slowly beside the boy. "A long time ago," he began, and his voice came rougher than usual, "in another place, a long, long way from this mountain, there was a younger man, and that younger man watched the sky the way I watch it now. And one winter, he saw a storm coming, just like this one. He saw it in the color of the light. He felt it deep in his bones." The room did not make a single sound. "He tried to tell folks," Ezra went on, staring into the flames. "He knocked on every door he could reach. He pointed up at that sky. He begged them, plain as he knew how, to get themselves ready." His jaw tightened, and they smiled at him. "The way you smile at a man who frets too much over nothing." And they went on back inside, to their warm suppers and their warm beds. A pause. And in the end, so did he. He stopped. For a moment, it seemed he might not be able to go on at all. "The storm came that night," he said finally, very quietly. "And by the time it had finished with them, it had taken the one soul that younger man loved most in all the wide world. Someone who had trusted him to keep them safe. Someone he could not reach in time. Someone the cold simply took." A log shifted in the stove. No one breathed. "He didn't have a house built into a mountain, you understand?" the old man said. "He had a fine, ordinary house, on fine, ordinary ground. The sensible kind. The kind everybody builds. The kind everybody nods at and calls wise." He drew a long, slow breath. "And when the worst of it finally came down out of that sky, it was not enough. It was not near enough." He lifted his head then, and he looked around the crowded room, at the sleeping children, at the weeping builder, at the humbled mayor with his eyes squeezed shut, at Eleanor Shaw, who had listened, at Roland Tate, frozen in his borrowed blanket, unable now to look away from the old man's face. "So that younger man grew older," Ezra said, "and one day he climbed up onto a mountain, and he built himself a house that could not be knocked down. Not a fine house, not a sensible house by anybody's reckoning." His voice caught just once and held. "A house that would hold." He swore to himself he would never again stand helpless out in the cold, watching the people he loved be carried off by a sky he had seen coming days before. Never again. Not while he still had 2 hands left to build with. The cabin was silent as a held breath. "You all called it the Fool's Cabin," the old man said, softer now. "Calloway's hole in the rock." And he almost smiled. "But it was never once built out of foolishness." He looked down at the gray old dog, lying there among the sleeping children. "It was built out of grief," he said simply. "Every last stone of it." For a long while after that, no one in that crowded room said a single word. And then, slowly, something began to change in the fire-lit faces all around him. The builder, Jonah Reed, who had stood in these very walls and called the whole thing foolishness, lowered his face into his rough hands and wept without any shame at all. The mayor closed his eyes and his lips moved on something that might have been a prayer. The young mother gathered her 2 sleeping children a little closer against her heart, and Roland Tate, the proud man, the cruel man, the man who had sworn before half the town to take this very ground for his own, sat very still in his borrowed blanket with the warmth of a stranger's fire on his face, and he found that he could not speak, because he understood now, far too late, and somehow just barely in time. He understood the thing he had spent the whole long winter laughing at. He had looked up at this ridge, season after season, and seen nothing but wasted land. He had never once seen the broken heart that had built upon it, the contempt that had followed Ezra Calloway through every season of that valley, the easy jokes, the careless laughter, the casual cruelty of comfortable men who had never once gone cold or hungry. It did not survive that night in the cabin. It could not have. For there is one thing in this world that no person can keep on laughing at once they have truly understood it. And that thing is love. You cannot mock a house once you know it was built by a grieving man so that no one else would ever have to grieve the way he had. One by one, in the deep heart of that storm, the people who had spent a winter mocking the old man found that the laughter had simply drained right out of them, and that something else had quietly come to take its place, something humbler, something that felt, in that warm and crowded dark, almost like shame, and almost like wonder, and almost like the first faint beginning of being grateful, simply to be alive at all. And still, beyond the granite walls, the storm raged on, and still the cabin held. Late that night, when the very last of them had finally drifted down into sleep, Ezra sat alone by the low and glowing fire, the old dog's heavy head resting warm across his foot. He looked around the crowded little room, at all those sleeping faces, at all those living, breathing souls, gathered safe beneath the granite, in the house that grief had built. A whole winter of being the fool of the valley. And now, this. Not one of them lost. Not yet. Not one. So long as the walls held and the fire burned and there was still a crust of bread to slice thin and share around. Adeline came and lowered herself down close beside him, the way she had sat beside him for the better part of a lifetime, and she took his old worn hand into both of hers, and she said nothing at all. There was nothing that needed saying. Together, the two of them kept watch over the sleeping town, and outside, far out in the screaming dark, the storm, at long last, began, very faintly, to change its voice. The change came not with a sound, but with the absence of one. For 5 days and 5 nights, the storm had been the whole of the world. Its roar had filled every waking hour, and crept down into every dream. The people had stopped truly hearing it, the way a body stops hearing the beat of its own heart. And then, sometime in the gray hour before the dawn, it simply stopped. The silence that came after was so sudden and so complete that it woke them. One by one, the sleeping souls in the crowded cabin opened their eyes. They lifted their heads from the borrowed blankets. They listened, hardly daring to breathe. And what they heard was nothing. No wind, no roar, no frantic clawing at the granite walls. Only the soft breathing of the people pressed close around them, and the low, faint ticking of a fire that had burned down through the long night to embers. Nobody spoke. It seemed, somehow, like a thing too fragile to break with words, as though the silence itself might shatter if a person reached for it too quickly. Then Ezra Calloway rose slow and stiff from his place beside the cold stove. He crossed the floor, stepping careful between the sleeping bodies, the old gray dog limping faithfully at his heel. He reached the heavy door. He laid one weathered hand upon the iron bolt, and he drew it back and pushed the door open onto a world made entirely new. Sunlight poured into the granite hollow. It came so bright, so sudden off all that fresh and gleaming snow that the people threw up their hands against it, blinking, their eyes streaming. After 5 long days of nothing but gray, the light felt almost like something holy, something they had forgotten the world still held in it. And then their eyes cleared, and they saw what the long storm had left behind. The valley below was gone, not destroyed exactly, transformed, buried. The town they had all known, the town of lanes and fences and softly lit windows, had vanished beneath a vast and silent ocean of white, the roads erased, the fences gone, as though they had never once divided one man's land from his neighbor's, the wagon paths swallowed whole. Drifts stood higher than rooftops. Some houses lay buried clear to their eaves, only a leaning chimney left to show where a home had been. And here and there, rising up out of the smooth white like the ribs of some great fallen beast, lay the broken backs of the barns that had not held. For a long, long while, no one in that doorway moved. The sheer size of it held them all silent. They had heard the storm. They had felt it shaking the walls around them through every hour of every night. But not one of them had truly understood until that bright and terrible morning what it would have meant to have faced a thing like that alone, in an ordinary house, on ordinary ground, without the old man who lived in the rock, and standing there in the doorway, in the blinding light, blinking down at the buried world they had so very nearly been buried with. One by one, they understood it now. The work began without a single person ever giving the order. That was the strange and quiet wonder of it. There was no speech, no plan laid out on a table, no man stepping forward to take command of the rest. The people simply looked down at their buried valley, and then they looked at one another, and something passed between them, wordless and certain and new, and they reached for the shovels, and they went down off that ridge together to dig their town back out of the snow. They worked as one. The rancher dug beside the shopkeeper. The mayor, his soft hands blistering inside their fine gloves, dug beside the lowliest ranch hand. The proud and the humble, the ones who had owned much, and the ones who had owned almost nothing at all. They bent their backs to the very same drifts. And somewhere in the long labor of it, not one of them seemed to remember anymore which of them had been which. They dug out the buried doors of the buried houses, and in nearly every one, they found families who had lived through the cold by burning whatever they could lay hands on. The furniture, the fence rails dragged in from the yard, the very floorboards pried up from beneath their own feet, frightened and frozen and hollow-eyed, but alive. The young mother went straight to her own small house the moment it was safe. She dug through her own door with her bare hands until others came to help her, and when at last they broke through, she stood a long moment in her cold and silent kitchen, holding her 2 children close against her. And she did not weep for what the storm had taken. She wept for what it had not, because her children were warm and breathing and alive in her arms. And they would not have been had a strange old man not opened a door to her in the dark. It was Eleanor Shaw, that whole long week of digging, who seemed to be everywhere at once. The woman who had listened, the woman who had laid in wood because a fool told her to, and who therefore had wood to spare. She went from buried house to buried house with what she had, sharing it out, the way the old man had taught the whole valley to share, up in the cabin in the dark. And hour by hour, day by day, the full weight of what had happened slowly revealed itself. The storm had tested every single roof in that valley. Some had held, many had not. But high above all of it, untouched, unbroken, steady as the morning it was first raised, the granite cabin kept its quiet watch over them all. When the worst of the digging was finally done, and the people had food again, and fires again, and roofs over their heads again, the town gathered. Not for a celebration. No one had the heart for that yet. Too much had been lost. They gathered because they needed to, because something had happened to them all, up on that mountain and down in that snow. And a thing like that cannot simply be carried home in silence. It has to be spoken. It has to be set down somehow, between people, where they can all look at it together. So they came together in the largest room, still standing in the valley. And it was Eleanor Shaw who rose first. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman for speeches. She simply reached into her apron and she drew out a small folded scrap of paper, soft and worn now from handling. "Most of you know me," she said quietly. "I sort your letters. I mind my counter. I don't say much." A faint, sad smile. "But not so long ago, a man came into my post office, and he took off his hat, and he told me plain that a storm was coming, the worst this valley had ever seen." The room had gone very still. "And I'll tell you what I did," Eleanor went on. "I didn't laugh, but I didn't believe him either, not all the way. I just wrote down the day, so that someone after could say he'd tried." She unfolded the little paper and held it up for them all to see. "Well, here's the day, in my own hand, before that storm ever broke." No one made a sound. "He came down off that mountain," she said, "and he warned every one of us, by name, to our faces, and we laughed at him, most of us. I near did myself." Her voice trembled just slightly and held. "And then, when it came just exactly the way he said it would, that same man opened his door to every soul that ever laughed." She folded the paper back up, gentle, like something precious. "I just thought," she said, "that ought to be remembered. That's all. That somebody warned us, and that we didn't listen, and that he saved us anyway." And then she sat back down. For a moment, no one moved at all. Then, slowly, the mayor rose. Conrad Pike, the soft, pleasant man who had leaned back in his comfortable chair and smiled, and told the old man, "We'll be just fine." He stood there now, before the whole town, and he looked older than he had a week ago, and smaller. "I'm the one he came to first," the mayor said. His voice was not steady. "He stood in my office, hat in his hands, and he told me. And I sent him on his way. I thanked him for his concern." He shut his eyes. "I have signed my name to a great many things in my time. Important things, I told myself. And not one of them mattered half so much as the day I told that man to go home and stop fretting." He opened his eyes and he looked toward the ridge, though the walls hid it from him. "There are people in this room," he said, "who are only breathing because a man I dismissed was wiser than I was. I will carry that, as I should." A pause. "I only pray I've the sense, from here on, to listen to the next quiet man who tells me something I don't want to hear." And he sat. And one by one, all through that room, others rose and said their own small piece. No grand speeches, no excuses, just simple, halting words from people who had laughed and who would not be laughing ever again. It was not the old man they were honoring, exactly. It was the listening, the thing they had all failed to do, and the thing they swore that day never to fail at again. It was on the second day of the digging that Roland Tate had come to the old man, and folks would speak of that moment too, for years and years to come. Ezra had been working a great drift near the heart of the ruined town, his breath clouding white in the bright cold air, when a long shadow fell across the snow beside him. He had straightened, he had turned, and there had stood. The proud man had looked smaller, even then, not broken, but lighter somehow, as though some hard and heavy thing he had carried his whole life had finally, somewhere up on that mountain, been set down for good. Behind him had stood his son, and the young mother, and a dozen others who had stopped their digging to watch, as though they all knew, without a word, that something was about to happen here that ought to be witnessed. And Roland Tate had reached up and taken the hat from off his own head and held it there in his two bare hands, in the bitter cold, bareheaded, before the whole gathered town, the way a man stands only when he means a thing, all the way down to the bottom of his soul. "I judged this all wrong, Calloway," he had said, and his voice had not steadied. Your cabin, every bit of it, and worse than judging it wrong. I judged it loud. I made good and sure the whole valley judged it right alongside me." Ezra had said nothing. He had only listened. "That land up on the ridge," Tate had gone on. "I wanted it. You knew it well as I did, and I'd have taken it. The first hard winter I could have called you a fool one time too many in front of enough people." His throat had worked. "And then that same fool's cabin everybody laughed at turned out to be the only reason my boy here isn't the one they're digging out of the snow right now." He had looked at his son, and something had passed between the two of them. "I came up that mountain in the dark to beg you," Tate had said. "Me, begging. And you opened the door before my fist had even finished falling. And then he had said the thing no soul in that valley would ever have believed of him. That high ground, the best grazing for 3 days' ride in any direction. I want to give it to the town, to everybody. Every last acre I ever schemed and lied to take. A murmur had run through the gathered people. So that this place, Tate had said, lifting his eyes to the cabin gleaming gold on the ridge, and what was done up there belongs to all of us now. So no soul in this valley ever again climbs that mountain in the dark, wondering if there'll be a door to open at the top of it. There'll just be one, always. Built right, built to hold, for anyone who ever needs it. And Ezra had looked at the proud man a long while, and what passed between them was not forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness was too small and simple a word for the size of it. It was understanding. The old man had put out his rough hand, and the proud man had taken it. And the two of them had stood there together in the ruined, gleaming valley, hand in hand in the cold, bright air. Two men who had spent a whole winter as bitter enemies, and who would spend whatever was left to them as something else entirely. Build it right, was all Ezra had said, and teach the young ones why it has to be. And here was the thing that proved it true. Roland Tate did not climb that ridge only the once. In the seasons that followed, the proud man came back, again and again, not to beg, and not to scheme, and not because any storm was coming. He came simply to sit a while by the old man's fire, to talk, to listen. It made no sense to anyone in the valley at first. The richest man in the county, climbing all that way to drink coffee with the fool he'd once tried to ruin. But the two of them understood it, even if no one else did. A man who has knelt frozen and begging at another man's door, and a man who has chosen to open that door instead of slamming it shut, are bound together after by something most folks are lucky enough never to need. They became, against all the odds in the world, friends. And the day finally came, years on, when Roland Tate told the old man that the best thing he had ever done with all his land and all his money was the day he gave the ridge away. I spent my whole life, he said, trying to own more than the next man. And the only thing I ever did that meant a thing was giving something back. He shook his head. You taught me that, Calloway. A fool in a hole in a rock. Taught me the one thing nobody with money ever bothers to learn. Ezra had only smiled at that. Wasn't me, he'd said. It was the cold. The cold teaches every man the same lesson in the end. I just had a warmer room to teach it in. The valley that came after the storm was not the same valley that had laughed at the old man. It could not be. You do not live through a night like that one, packed shoulder to shoulder with the very people you had mocked. Kept alive through the dark by the very man you had called a fool, and then walk back out into the world unchanged. The people learned. They learned to watch the color of the morning light, the way the old man watched it. They learned to read the clouds gathering on the far peaks, and to feel the turning of the wind before ever it arrived. And when they rebuilt their homes that spring, they did not throw them up the old sensible way, square and proud on the open ground. They studied the land first. They asked it questions, the way the old man had taught them to. They built low against the sheltering slopes and tucked into the lee of the hills and braced their roofs against the winds the old man swore would surely come again one day. And the builder, Jonah Reed, the very man who had once stood inside the rising walls of that cabin and sworn a house in a rock would never stand, became the one who taught all the others how to build that way. He never once spoke of his old judgment. He never needed to. He had wept on the floor of that cabin with his living son held tight in his arms, and that was a sermon louder than any words a man could ever say. And his boy grew up. That thoughtful, uncertain boy. The one who had looked at the old man in the street and asked him, in the deep of the storm, "Why did you build it here?" He grew up to be a builder himself. And when the town at last raised its great shelter up on the high ground that Roland Tate had given, a strong and sheltered place where anyone caught out in any storm could always find a door, it was that young man who built it, with his father's hands, and the old man's wisdom, and a memory in his heart that he would carry to the very end of his days. And the children grew up hearing the story, not the story of a storm. Storms come, and storms go, and the young soon forget them. They grew up hearing the story of a man the whole town had called a fool, who opened his door to every single soul that had ever laughed at him, and turned not one of them away. That was the lesson the valley chose to keep. Not beware the weather, but be careful, be so very careful, who you call a fool. For the old man himself, the change was a far quieter thing, and it ran deeper than any of them could ever see. Something had been carried up that mountain a long, long time ago. A grief, a guilt, a wound that no number of turning years had ever once been able to close. The memory of a storm he had seen coming. The memory of a soul he had loved more than his own life. And the memory of a door he had not been able to open in time. He had built the whole cabin to answer that one old grief, stone by stone, beam by beam, with his own two aging hands. It was a promise made to the dead, a vow that he would never again stand helpless in the cold. And on that bright and silent morning, watching the people pour out of his door alive, watching the children run shrieking and laughing through the new fallen snow, children who would surely have died in the night without him, something in the old man, at the very last, let go. He could not save the one he had lost. He had carried that hard truth like a stone lodged deep in his chest for more years than he cared to count. But he had saved these, every soul in that crowded room, and somewhere in the saving of them, the stone he had carried so long grew, for the first time in all his life, just a little lighter to bear. Adeline saw it in his face that morning. She had been waiting the better part of a lifetime to see it. She came and stood beside him in the doorway, in the holy light, and she slipped her old hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," said Ezra, and she let him have that, because it was true, and because it was like him, and because she had loved that very thing about him for longer than either of them could rightly remember. But she knew, in her own quiet heart, the thing he would never once say out loud, that the younger man he had been so long ago, the one who knocked on doors no one ever answered, the one who had stood helpless and screaming into another storm, in another life, that younger man could finally, after all these long years, lay himself down and rest. The wound had not been erased. Some wounds never are, but it had, at the very last, begun to heal. The years that followed were good years, long ones, the kind a body learns to be grateful for. The town grew into something better than it had ever been before, a true place, a place where people knew each other's names and watched each other's roofs, and remembered every single winter to ask the land what it had in store before the cold came down. And the old man and his wife grew old together in their cabin in the rock, slower now, grayer now, but warm and safe, and never once alone, for there was always someone climbing that ridge to see them, to bring them fresh bread and news from the valley below, to sit a while by their good fire, to ask the old man, one more time, if he wouldn't tell how he had read the sky, and to listen this time, to truly listen, the way the whole valley had finally learned how. But time in the end comes for every living thing under heaven, and one soft evening, when the snow lay gentle and untroubled on the mountain, and the last of the light was going gold and long across the valley, the old gray dog lay himself down by the cabin door, in the place he had always loved the best, the place that looked out over the whole town below. And Cinder did not get up again. He had kept his watch faithfully, that old dog, for more years than most of his kind are ever given. He had stood upon the ridge and stared down a coming storm before any human eye could see it. He had crossed a crowded floor in the deep of the dark to lie himself down beside a frightened, weeping child. He had warmed the cold and gentled the afraid, and asked for nothing in all his long life but a hand laid soft on his head, and a place by the fire, and the nearness of the people he loved. They buried him there, high on the ridge, in the very spot where he had chosen to lie himself down, facing the valley, keeping his watch. Even then, Ezra Calloway stood a long while at the small grave that evening, his old hand resting on Adeline's shoulder, the gold light fading slow and soft over the mountains the two of them had given their whole lives to. He did not weep. He was too old, and he had grieved far too much in his time for easy tears, but Adeline felt the long breath go out of him, slow and deep, the breath of a man gently letting go of one more thing that he had loved. He knew it was coming, the old man said quietly. That first storm, long before any of the rest of us. He always did know. A pause. Good old soul. He did, said Adeline. And he was. And the two of them stood together in the gathering dusk, beside the resting place of the dog who had once warned a whole town. And they were quiet. And they were, in the deepest part of them, at peace. Many winters came and went after that. The cabin still stood. It always stood. Long, long after the old man and his good wife had been laid to their own rest, up on that same windswept ridge, beneath that same wide and watching sky they had read together for so many years. And still, the people climbed up to see it. Some came to study the way it had been built, those clever low walls, those sheltered sloping ways, the quiet secrets the old man had paid for in grief, and then given away, every last one of them, for free. But most who climbed came for the story. They would stand in the doorway where the old man had once stood and look out and down at the valley spread below them, green in the summer, white in the deep of the winter, alive and well, and watched over in every turning season, and someone among them, often as not, would tell it once again. The story of the man the whole town had called a fool, the man who built himself a house out of a broken heart, the man who, when the worst night anyone could ever remember came howling down off that mountain, opened his door and turned away no one, not one soul, not even the man who had sworn to take everything he had. And in the opening of that door, a man who had spent the better part of his life unable to forgive himself for one single door he could not open in time, finally, gently laid that old and terrible burden down. The wind still crosses that ridge even now. The snow still falls. The seasons still turn, the way they always have, and the way they always will, long after every name in this story has faded soft into the years. But inside the granite hollow, the air stays calm and warm and still. And just beyond the door, in the place that looks out over the whole wide valley below, an old dog's resting place keeps its watch over the town that his master saved, not coldly, not as a monument, not as a warning or a secret kept locked away in the stone, but gently, the way a thing keeps its watch when it has finally, after so very long and hard a journey, found its peace.